Welcome to episode 5 of the Data Driven Strength podcast. Apparently having, a few dozen listeners has qualified us to have our first guest on the show. So today we have Mike Tuchscherer, owner and founder of Reactive Training Systems. So just generally speaking, we use a lot of emerging strategies, concepts, and a lot of concepts that Reactive Training Systems has popularized. Even though we might have a slightly different practical application of some of these concepts and maybe prioritize some things more than they generally do, we know that Mike has heard all of the things we're likely going to discuss today. And in our discussions so far, he has always had good responses. And what we appreciate is that it's, our discussions are never that thing A is right or wrong, or thing B is right or wrong. So hopefully this will be a good discussion. This podcast episode was inspired by a post that Mike made. So I'll just kind of throw it over to Zach, and he can kind of give a brief overview of the post and kind of some of our thought process.
Yeah, so I don't know how long ago it was, Mike, maybe like a week or so ago, he, traveled down to his basement, fired up the old meme generator, and just decided he really wanted to, just take a stab at some of the periodization purists. And but just in general, the post, I think, was, I'm curious to see kind of what inspired that, Mike, and just kind of your thought process by the whole kind of general concept. But just overall, to give the listeners, it was kind of on the discussion of hypertrophy blocks. How long does it take for meaningful hypertrophy to occur? How long does it take for that meaningful hypertrophy? Meaningful is kind of in quotes. That might be part of the thing you discussed, Mike. But how long does it take for that gain in muscle size to integrate into strength gain, and all the kind of factors that go into that, and just kind of hypertrophy blocks and maybe a little bit of periodization in general. But yeah, Mike, I'm just really curious to kind of toss it over to you and just kind of talk about what inspired that post, kind of maybe the main takeaways you were kind of trying to get out there, and why you tried to make us all cry.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, it was definitely a shot at you guys. I mean, I know we've had a civil conversation before, but I thought, what better way to burn that bridge forever than to take a meme shot at someone on the internet. I mean, it is whatever year it is now. Anyway, so I think that's just kind of how things are done, right? Like you just torch other powerlifters via meme, right? That's how, yeah. Anyway, no. I guess kind of maybe the best way for me to talk about this. So memes are generally terrible mediums. So I don't know why I chose that route. I mean, maybe because that's the way it popped in my head for whatever reason. But probably a better way to frame a discussion would be to start with like kind of what we do and my view of it. So like, to me, the way I address hypertrophy in the training that I write tends to not be in the form of a block of training. If you think of a hypertrophy block, a lot of times you think of this chunk of training time that's set aside to be dedicated purely to hypertrophy. I don't really do that. At most, what I'll do, if say I feel like hypertrophy is really something that I need to focus on, we'll use one of our development blocks and gear 80% plus of the training toward things that would generally be considered hypertrophy, but we're still gonna use kind of a Charlie Francis style vertical integration concept, which is, even if the training tilts toward hypertrophy, you're still going to have the other components present, and we would still want the strength components present, and we would judge the success or failure of that block based on what happens to your strength. So kind of some of the thoughts that kind of underpin the meme that I posted. is that you hear people talk about like how long does it take for meaningful hypertrophy? Oh, you're an advanced lifter, you're not going to see a meaningful hypertrophy for X number of weeks. You know, beginners can see hypertrophy in Y number of weeks. You know, okay. From a performance standpoint, it's meaningful if it contributes to your performance. It's not really that meaningful if it doesn't. And my thought is like, okay, the process of adding extra actin and myosin cross bridges at some level, you know, that's either going to have an impact on your 1RM or it's not. And if it's going to have an impact on your 1RM, you know, I would expect that. I can't think of a reason why it would take additional blocks of training to transmutate that hypertrophy into 1RM strength unless you just weren't doing anything remotely close to the competition skill and you had skill deterioration, which is going to kind of mask whatever strength benefits occur, right? But assuming that you're maintaining your skill, then, you know, the strength gains to be netted by hypertrophy, I can't think of a reason why it would just take, you know, an additional 6 or 8 weeks after that for the change to occur. So I think I'm monologuing a little bit. So tell me if you think I'm crazy.
I think right off the bat, it's important to emphasize that we would agree with 99.9% of that. So, you know, you said...
Including that Mike's crazy, just to be clear there. We also agree with
that. That's fair.
You know, I think perhaps a good starting point is to kind of talk about the things we definitely agree with, and especially how powerlifting training has strayed from traditional block periodization. So, you know, you mentioned that, you know, even if the training is optimized or more biased towards hypertrophy outcomes, the other components are still present. We absolutely agree with that. And you said to maintain skill, and that's actually exactly how we like to frame it if we are programming a block of training in which it is biased toward hypertrophy. So, you know, right off the bat, I agree with that 100%. And I also think I agree with you. I'm not sure where I stand quite on this in terms of what you're saying about why it would take additional blocks of training to transmutate. I think I agree with that, but, you know, perhaps a slight, you know, one point you made, I would take a slightly different approach to is you said you would judge the block based on the strength outcomes. And I think those go hand in hand of, you know, whether the short-term strength outcome is indicative of the block of training. And just right off the bat, I think it depends on how you organize your training plan. So that in, you know, the way that I view it is if you can set things up so that short-term accrual of actin and myosin cross bridges can translate to the strength performance. Whereas you might be able to set things up a slightly different way where that is masked in the short term, and thus you cannot actually use the short-term strength performance to indicate the effectiveness of the present training, right? The most recent training. So those are just some thoughts off the top of my head. Again, the agreement is 99%. It's just perhaps maybe we would emphasize the hypertrophy aspect slightly more at the cost of short-term strength development. But I don't want to say cost in the sense of overreaching or performance decreasing, but perhaps a slightly slower rate of strength gain. So I'll stop right there, and Zach, you can add any color to that.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in just a little bit, just to frame that even a little bit more with kind of like where we were and where we are now. So if we go back to kind of the block periodization model we were talking about, and like Mike said, typically in those models, when you're doing hypertrophy, that's all you do. So you're only doing sets of 10. And like Mike said, and you know, Josh, we've noticed this a ton too, what you're going to get in that regard is a ton of skill detraining. And so in my mind, that's an example where the estimated 1RM is probably going to decrease, like you said, Mike. But if we do have some of those components that we talked about, maintaining strength, skill, or hopefully even building a little bit, I think it's conceivable that there is an example in which, the way that the rest of the training is set up can block, your ability to see a really rapid increase in estimated 1RM. I like Josh said, I don't think we would advocate for a decline in estimated 1RM per se, but I think it's conceivable to say if we organize, the general principles of hypertrophy training that obviously need to be individualized, of course, training closer to failure, maybe training with longer ranges of motion, potentially training with higher volumes, all those things probably are going to increase the likelihood that fatigue could mask some of the immediate integration of that muscle mass. But I do agree, from a conceptual basis, it doesn't really make sense that it wouldn't immediately help you out. I just think maybe there's a tax that comes with, some of the way that you organize training that probably comes with a little bit extra fatigue. But I do think developmental cycle, if you're comparing those with one another, I do think that would make sense. If some of that fatigue goes away on like week 1, you should see some integration of that muscle mass if it's occurring. So from a block to block perspective, I think that makes total sense. I just think there might be a chance that if the variables are set up in a certain way, that we could or could not say, depending on the individual, is going to maybe increase the rate at which that muscle mass is accrued. That could have the potential to mask that increase in estimated 1RM, although the capacity might still be there. So I'll let you, again, Mike, we know that you've heard this before, so I'm sure you're jumping at the gun here to respond, and I'm curious to see what you have to say.
No, that's a really good point, and that's something that I think is worth drawing out. That Josh, especially with kind of how you frame that, as far as the other variables in the program matter a lot to when this is going to be visible. And I know that in terms of thinking about ideal hypertrophy, that's probably kind of a different tactic between us, is that you guys prefer to carry a bit more fatigue through those hypertrophy phases, and I am a little more conservative with that. Like, I want to be able to see those week-to-week performance changes if they're occurring, and if I'm being honest, I think like some things are better than others, and so I'm sure that one of these approaches is better than the other, but I don't know that it's so central or so elemental that one is just obviously the way to go. I've said before, kind of my bias in terms of avoiding that kind of fatigue in the past, when we've had that fatigue accumulation, it's never spectacular. The next block after that will be kind of what we would have expected. It's never worked for me. And I mean, clearly it does work for other people. So I'm sure that means it's something that I'm doing wrong, or something that one of these things is not like the other. Right. So, but I mean, that's also part of kind of exploring and finding your own system as a coach too. I think, you've got to, if there is something like that everyone is doing and finding results with, but it's just not working for you, then maybe don't kill yourself trying to figure out like this one little tactic. There's other things to be concerned about. And I would say like that kind of attitude is really central to what I see emerging strategies as. Like you mentioned emerging strategies in kind of the prelude here. And as time has gone on, I've started to think of it more as just a way of thinking about training, and a way to think about its organization and like what you're learning from it, more than, hey, it's just repeating the same week every week. Like, I think you can, the point is the epistemology. The point is that you're learning something about athlete response, and it's acknowledging that, hey, if we change stuff too much, that kind of clouds the signal a little bit, and it's just trying to deal honestly with that. And I think the way that the system of emerging strategies as I teach it is taught in a certain way so that it tries to maximize that signal to noise ratio, but you definitely don't have to live there. It's not like everything else is silly and invalid. There's plenty of ways to do it. And really, as time has gone on, I'm finding situations where it's like, well, it makes sense to introduce a little bit more variation. And yeah, that does cloud your signal to noise, but it's worth it. It's worth the trade-off in some places. It's just, that's the benefit, is the knowledge to be gained. Anyway, I'm just realizing now that that's a tangent. That's not really where we were at. So feel free to bring me back on topic, I guess.
No, I think that was great. I mean, I think I totally agree with that. And I think Josh would as well. I think we were talking about off air a little bit, is like, from the epistemological lens, like you said, like, I think emerging strategies is beautiful, and it really, like you said, as a method to think about training, I think it's just very, very sound, and that's what we love about it. I think just from a practical application standpoint, Josh and I always say, like, maybe we don't apply it from that week to week basis, but from like a cycle to cycle or a block to block basis, that's exactly kind of how we think about things. So it's just kind of removing that unit of training, or whatever you're calling it, a little bit farther out. But if you're not acknowledging the athlete response and trying to shove a square peg in a round hole, that obviously doesn't make any sense, regardless of what method you're using to come to that conclusion. So I think that was huge. But just to go back to the hypertrophy point a little bit, this is what I just wanted to chime in. On video here, Mike is probably bigger than Josh and I put together. So just for what that's worth, just take that into account for any hypertrophy methods that we propose and Mike may propose. I just think that's valuable information to know.
Biggest guy in the gym, right?
yeah, of course. I mean, that just needs to be noticed for sure. So Josh, go ahead. I'll kick it over to you. I don't know if you want to bring us back on topic. I think I was following with Mike's epistemology lens a little bit too much. I enjoy those conversations. So.
No, I think that's actually, Mike, you said it was a tangent, but I don't think it was much of a tangent at all. I think it's very much related. And I think that's a good way to kind of conceptualize potential differences in practical application. So, you like to talk about the signal to noise ratio and making that ratio as big as possible so that you can detect response. And I agree that the best way to do that is a framework like yours. And kind of thinking about our own weaknesses of our model, as much as I don't like to use that word, it is harder for us to know exactly what part works. Because like Zach said, our quote unquote unit that we are analyzing is more so the training cycle, as opposed to, and the training cycle being a sequence of, 2 or 3 training blocks, as opposed to the training week, which does reduce your signal to noise ratio, which is a downside of our approach. And another bias we have, that I think we are continually reminded we have this bias, is that we take a very muscle-centric view to strength training, and we we really emphasize the importance of a bigger muscle is a stronger muscle, right? Even though that's kind of a contentious topic in some circles, we do put a lot of stock in that. So basically the way that I would frame it is that by potentially squeezing a little bit more and taking some short-term negative consequences of eking out that kind of muscle-centric hypertrophy point of view, you lose some of that signal to noise ratio. But our bias as of now is that trade-off might be worth it to us. But I think it might depend on the individual situation, training status, that kind of stuff as well. But that's kind of, I guess, a decent way of framing kind of our stance. And again, everything is a trade-off. So yeah, that's kind of where I would frame it.
Well, I really like that line of thinking too. And So in some conversations with Bryce Lewis, one thing that he's asked me before is like, well, if it's about reducing signal to noise ratio, then why don't you just do the competition lifts? Like you could just do like comp lifts only, daily 1 RM, and that's the highest possible signal to noise ratio, right? So why don't you start there and then let the program evolve? And from a logic standpoint, yeah, you know, but I mean, a judgment standpoint, I mean, he's not advocating that either, just to be perfectly clear. But I get where he's coming from. But it is a great job of pointing out that we are all drawing the line somewhere in the middle. And where I'm drawing the line with emerging strategies is more toward that maximizing signal to noise ratio end of things. I think a lot of other smart coaches, data focused coaches are aware of this and just drawing the line somewhere else. You know, and another thing that kind of comes along for the ride is that there are, you know, I hate to turn into like the vague, you know, coaches these days kind of rant, but I guess I would just say that it's not that. It's that it's an acknowledgement of kind of where I was before emerging strategies came along. I didn't really have a great systematic way of figuring out what was working well for my athletes on an individual basis. It was more just looking at things and just kind of trusting my own powers of observation that I'm going to see the patterns as they come up. And like that just is not a thing that sits real well with me. I'm sure it doesn't sit well with you guys either, you know. So having a system of figuring out individualized responses, I think, is important, you know. And yeah, I mean, whether that's a week to week thing or a block to block thing, I mean, I think at that point it's still an interesting conversation to have, don't get me wrong, but we're a hell of a lot closer to being on the same page at that point versus, you know, just, well, if you're just paying attention, then you'll see the patterns. Like, no, you probably won't. And your ability to pay attention is probably not as good as you think it is, you know, especially, you know, once you really start getting into this. And if you have any sort of success, you start getting busy, then it gets easy to not do that sort of thing. And so having a system that helps you is critical, I think.
Yeah, that's one thing I always notice, like when I'm doing like some self-reflection, is like you said, Mike, you were in a point in time where you were kind of just like trusting your intuition and just like kind of post hoc rationalizing, oh, this went well for this reason, or this went well for this reason. And I think to some degree, like, again, acknowledging our own weaknesses, we can kind of do that with muscle mass to some degree. And I think that it feels like it's a comfortable rationalization, and it feels like that should be okay. So like, for example, like a cycle goes well, oh, we just didn't put enough muscle mass on. A cycle goes, a cycle goes well, it's because we put on a ton of muscle mass. A cycle goes poorly, we just didn't put enough muscle mass on. It's like you can always have that answer, and that definitely doesn't sit well with me. But at the same time, I kind of believe that, if that makes sense, like to some degree. Like if things didn't go well, if we were to put on more muscle mass, probably would have helped. And like it's like that. I don't have a good system to detect whether that happened or whether that didn't happen. So it's just like this underlying intuition that I try to just have to acknowledge. And if there was a system or a cute way we could measure muscle mass, that would make this whole process a lot easier, because then we could have an emerging strategies framework for muscle mass, and we could have an emerging strategies framework for short-term strength, and everything would be great. And we'd all be coaching the same way, and then we could just do it as robots, and it'd be perfect. But until that exists, yeah, I don't know. It's a hard problem to solve, because I guess the way I kind of view it, just viewing, kind of using the emerging strategies terminology, the way I would kind of like the metric of the estimated 1RM, there has to be some type of thing we're looking for in like in a block that we would gauge as successful that's tied to muscle size. And then wherever you want to draw that line, where we would shift it kind of to more how you do it now, where the metric that we care about is estimated 1RM. That's kind of how I view it in my mind. However close to the meat you want to do that is up to, kind of your experience and how you want to do that. But I guess theoretically, that's kind of how I view it, is that there's a line to draw in the sand where short-term progress doesn't necessarily tell me what's going to be best in the long term. And it's just finding and drawing that line kind of in the sand wherever your experience, but also intuition kind of tells you where that trade-off is okay. And we've talked about this a couple of times. I'm just kind of reflecting on what you guys have said thus far, but hopefully that has some sort of talking off point for you, Mike. I don't know. That wasn't even a question, so that was pretty terrible, but go for it, man.
No, man, well, I was just kind of wondering, like, maybe we could use that as a jumping off point to explore that space a little bit. Like I've had the similar thoughts, right? Like, how do you quantify gains of muscle mass? Because like what we're talking about are fairly small gains, and it's below our ability to measure it, especially for lay people, but probably, I guess, in a lab setting as well. Like you've got somebody who's been training for 15 years and they do a 6-week hypertrophy block. Like, can you measure anything even? So an idea, you see lots of different ideas floating around, right? Like, well, if you are gaining strength in a variety of exercises in kind of the broadly considered hypertrophy rep range, then you can take that as an indicator that you're adding muscle mass. But one idea that I have thought about a little bit, and I'd be interested in y'all's take on it. What about like an isometric contraction? Like it's pretty low skill, fairly non-invasive. Well, it's non-invasive and just not all that demanding. But if your strength improves in a isometric contraction, could you fairly reasonably assume that you've added muscle mass?
I just want to jump in here quick. I'll pitch it over to Josh to get most of his thoughts first, but that is an excellent idea. And this has been one thing I've always thought of in terms of like just looking at the research, like, you compare high and low loads to failure, different strength gains, but similar hypertrophy gains. But what's often not talked about, as far as I'm aware, the isometric strength gains are very, very similar. So what you just said makes a ton of sense in my mind, because isometric strength generally, as long as it's not practice, so like if one group practices the isometric test and the other group doesn't, then it's a little bit different because it's obviously a strength skill. But if it's an unpracticed strength test, as far as I'm aware, it seems to scale pretty well with muscle mass. So if you had somebody do a developmental block and it's like totally not in their program, but every, the week that they peak or whatever you find that logistically feasible, if you did an isometric test, I think that's definitely at least in the realm of like better than what we have now. So I think that's a really, really interesting idea. So I'll kick it over to Josh, see what he has.
I don't think I have much to add. I think I came across a product called Force Hooks one time, and it basically looks like a J cup, and you can perform a maximal isometric contraction, and it'll measure the force output. And I had briefly interacted with the owner, and I was kind of probing this idea to him, like, can I use this as an indicator of performance to auto-regulate training? And to be fair, the guy wasn't a powerlifter or powerlifting coach. But for some reason, I got discouraged about that idea, and I haven't really revisited it. But I'm going to revisit it after this call. I right off the top of my head, I don't necessarily have a reason to, I don't have any serious downsides or things we wouldn't be accounting for there. So that is a really interesting idea. I mean, my head goes to, what's the advantage to that compared to a velocity at a given load? Yes, that requires more skill, but again, I think it goes back to we're keep the goal is where my head goes. So, but I know the focus is measuring hypertrophy. So I have two thoughts in my head that are not that are not agreeing with each other right now. And I'm not
Well,
sure.
let's change the hypothetical a little bit, and let's say that you were training a bodybuilder at that point. Like, does that shift the trade-off in terms of like looking at velocity at a certain load versus isometric force output?
I think there's quite a few factors that could go into velocity at a given load, to be honest. So I think, you know, some of the neuromuscular adaptations that you wouldn't really care about as a bodybuilder are going to be factoring in with that. So you like the point being, you could get improved performance in that from something other than just hypertrophy, which is kind of what we're trying to narrow down. So it'd be similar to estimate 1RM, like what's contributing to that increase is kind of my question.
There would be other neuromuscular factors for the isometric test as well.
True, but it's not practiced, I guess is kind of my view. So like you could have, you know, some type of, you know, rate coding, you know, general neuromuscular adaptations, increased agonist activation, that kind of stuff. But it seems to me, just from what I've seen, like in the literature, like that seems to be accounted for to some degree, and it scales pretty well with muscle mass as far as I'm aware. I'm probably missing some things. I haven't thought about this. Mike just brought it up on the air to make me look stupid, clearly. But off the top of my head,
that's the strategy.
Yeah, just playing gotcha tactics. I see how it is. I mean, first writing memes, now he's doing this on the podcast. You know, he's just a bad guy. But no, I think off the top of my head, I think that is a better idea than anything we have right now. At least I'm curious. I might have to think about buying an isometric thing or something to figure out that force hooks. Maybe they'll be our sponsor, Josh. So you just give them too much airtime. So maybe we'll get some out of this and see if we can play around with it. But I think that's a really, really good idea. And at least to my knowledge right now, has the least downsides to what we're using. But yeah, I think that's a good idea.
So I don't think we have a good answer to your question, Mike, but it's definitely interesting. Just to kind of pivot, going back to the whether it's justified to have a hypertrophy emphasis, and perhaps I don't want to say put top end strength performance on the back burner, but at least be okay with a slower rate of gain. How we justify this, and I'll be very interested to hear you poke holes in this, is that if we just think about, you know, the exercise science research as a whole, the recommendations to maximize short-term strength outcomes are different than the configuration of training to maximize short-term hypertrophy. That's not to say you can't adjust the quote-unquote hypertrophy training to minimize the differences, right? There's of course overlap, but I'm curious, kind of just from a high-level point of view, how you conceptualize that, because there might be slightly different, slightly different areas where you want the training variables for each of those two outcomes.
It's a good question. I'll do my best to lead you through this thought process, but I guess I'll start with the caveat that I haven't really gone through this a lot before, so this is, you know, the rough equivalent of thinking out loud in public. So we'll, you know, I guess you know, I get a gotcha, and you guys can have one in turn. But no, so kind of, I guess the way that I think about it is I'm trying to assume as little as possible. And I mean, you can't assume literally nothing, but I think reducing your number of assumptions is, you know, generally the way to go. So sorry for the background noise if that's bothering anybody, but yeah, that's the life, right? But okay, so generally I think the way to go is by reducing your number of assumptions. And yeah, like theoretically, I'm with you that I think muscle mass is going to improve strength outcomes. I just think that that's true. But I also don't want to have any hubris in that belief, So if I could have some sort of way to prove it on an individual basis, that would be ideal. And that informs, a good part of the way that I'll construct the training variables, like what we were talking about, like reducing the amount of fatigue, or just not planning the training load so that it accumulates fatigue. And so in the short run, you may want to train differently to maximize one of those two qualities. But I think that's not really the situation that I find myself in with an athlete. It's more of a medium or long-term progression question, because we're looking at block over block over block over block progression. So you may have a lot of success in the very first block that you wrote, but like, let's say that you train to maximize strength expression in a short term for a block. This athlete's blocks are 5 weeks long, so you train to maximize their strength outcomes in 5 weeks, and you do that by maximizing things like neuromuscular output. Well, you're going to hit a point of diminishing returns on that pretty soon, and your additional benefit in subsequent blocks is going to start looking worse and worse. You're going to maintain strength. You're going to have some blocks that look a little bit like wins, some blocks that look like you're losing, but then you try something different. And then you try a something that's more hypertrophy training, and you find more fertile ground there. So then you exploit that for a while, and you train with more volume, and you're accumulating your gains that way. And then maybe, I guess theoretically, at some point that becomes you're getting less results block on block with that type of strategy. Now, whether that's due to some physiological limiting factor that needs to be removed, or if it's just a sensitivity to training or boredom on the part of the athlete, that doesn't really matter to me as much. I want to, like you said, Josh, keep the goal. I think you could make that the whole title of the damn podcast. That's so important and so easy to lose sight of, that again, we're coming at this from the context of training a powerlifter. You have to keep 1RM expression as the goal, and I guess kind of where I'm at is like, what happens if you just take that almost as far as you can, of course, again, to Bryce's point, you've got to make some concessions at some point, because it starts to look silly if you take any idea fully to its conclusion, I guess. But yeah, I suppose that's enough. What do you guys think?
I have a follow-up question, just because I'm curious. I think it's related. It might not seem related right off the bat, but I'm curious, when you're writing a training week, right, the microcycle for the development cycle, are you consciously thinking of this exercise, the goal is quadriceps hypertrophy, or like this is the primary outcome of this slot, for example? Or I'm just curious how you kind of, because it's really interesting how you agree with us that a bigger muscle is a stronger muscle and all that stuff, and you prioritize that as well. I'm just curious how you kind of approach it from a thought process point of view when actually writing training.
Yeah, I suppose I do. There's a bit of a competing thoughts, I guess, in my mind when I'm thinking about the theoretical side of this. On the one hand, you have, like, if you look at the very best AI systems, the systems that outperform humans, they tend to be atheoretical. You know, they're not fed a bunch of say that you have an AI system that wins at chess or wins at Go or something like that. The really good ones are not theoretical. They're just playing to win the game, and they're not taught any of those rules ahead of time. And I think that's interesting and valuable. So what ends up happening to me is I'm looking at these block reviews, right? And say I'll look at like a meta block review, and it's showing me a list of exercises, and you can sort them by, gain rate or peak estimate 1RM. So say you're looking at a cluster of exercises that are associated with really good blocks for this athlete. On one hand, I want to be atheoretical about that and say these exercises are the ones that are good. And I think that if you're in exploit mode, that's probably where you want to be. These exercises are good, pick one from the list, But when you're in explore mode, I mean, picking randomly can work in AI models because they're picking millions and millions of trials, right? We don't have that luxury because we're dealing with one athlete with a finite lifespan. So picking randomly kind of is a strategy that doesn't make sense. So it has to be kind of informed choosing. So if I'm looking at that same meta block review and I see, oh, they responded well to lunges, to Bulgarian split squats, to reverse lunges, like all these things seem to do well. Well, what if we do front foot elevated lunges, or what if we do step ups? Like those seem like reasonable places to explore. We might find something else that's effective there. So I guess that's kind of again, thinking out loud while we're talking here. But I guess that's kind of where I'm at with it, is that it's that explore exploit dichotomy.
That's extremely interesting, and I kind of just thought of a new way to conceptualize. Again, I don't want to emphasize the differences between our two approaches because they are so small, but
no, that's fine. I mean, we know this, and I enjoy the creativity fuel here.
Awesome. So you guys are extremely outcome oriented, right? And you very much keep the goal. We might, and maybe this is a blind spot, and maybe this is a downside to kind of being, I guess, very heavily research based, is that we kind of focus on the individual pieces that we know will increase the outcome because we have all this research and exercise science to indicate that's the case. But to argue for emerging strategies and the outcome oriented approach, in order for the outcome to increase, you need to improve the pieces. And for each individual, there's no way for me to look at an individual and say, you need to improve this piece more than the other piece. I can guess, and I might be right more than half the time, but I'm not going to be perfect, right? We're all human. So by focusing on the outcome, you take care of worrying about the pieces, and it works itself out instead of playing the guess game of this person needs a greater proportion of hypertrophy training than this person. And you will pick that up, and you might be able to say, oh, it looks like when we're doing higher rep range stuff, slightly closer to failure, slightly longer range of motion, blocks seem to go well. Maybe this is an indication that our greatest room to grow, this individual's estimated 1RM, is through hypertrophy training. But you might not actually label it that. It just, you kind of come to that conclusion a different way. So
yeah, exactly.
I very much enjoyed that answer, and just kind of
no, you're right on it. And I would say that another layer that I would add to it, and I think that you're right, and your approach is correct as far as improving the components of strength will improve the net of strength. One thing that I wrestle with from time to time is just the complexity of the whole person, and that's kind of where I like the highly pragmatic approach. I think, and I'm no philosopher, but I think in the sense of like pragmatic philosophy, more not just like the. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting hung up on nothing. But I like focusing on the outcomes because if we knew without a doubt that, I guess since we're here, we'll pick on you guys a little bit, that you can train at 6-7 RPE, let's say, and it doesn't really compromise hypertrophy at all. In fact, you can accumulate more volume that way, so it might even be better, right? But then you have an individual athlete who just hates training that way, so they're not as bought in and stuff like that. My thought is, well, that'll show up in the outcome of the training, that they're not applying themselves, and that, they apply themselves more fully to higher RPE stuff, and it nets them a better result. So that would be the way to go. I mean, I'm sure that you guys do the same stuff. You probably just get to that answer with a slightly different algorithm.
Yeah, I just to chime in on that a little bit. I think that's totally a great way to think about it. Like you said, I think we come to that conclusion just in a different way. We kind of, like Josh said, we kind of have these components we think will improve the goal the most. And then if somebody in one of those pieces is intent, focus, how much you enjoy the training, and we very, very much acknowledge that. And it's not just hypertrophy training is this, strength training is this. We're research nerds. This is how you do it. It's not that, because we're definitely been burned by that probably when I was like 16 and just thought I knew everything and was a world beater. But yeah, the intent, the focus, how much you enjoy the training is very much one of those pieces. And it's the interaction of all of them that we're trying to take into account to improve the goal. So I think, we may have this theoretical basis that piece A, that's hypertrophy training, may tell us to do, maybe closer to failure or whatever. But if this person simply hates that, the combination of these components won't lead to the outcome of the pieces that we want anyway, based on the information we have. So that's a very, very natural conclusion to come to. Granted, your the way that you think about it definitely has less assumptions, built on that. I think I'm losing my train of thought here, Josh. You might have to rescue me. I had a point that I was going to say, but I'm rolling off. I was too much on that one. I was going to roll into the Bulgarian thought experiment if we want to. I don't know if that's kind of the one thing. So one thing me and Josh were talking about, Mike, that again, you've heard all these examples before. So I'm sure you have an answer to this. I know Greg on the one of the anecdotes and observations, I think that Eric Helms did, that you guys talked about this to some degree. One thing that we kind of were just tossing around is kind of like a thought experiment to kind of explain why maybe we have come to this slightly different practical conclusion is, let's say you have an athlete that performs a block, and for whatever reason his intake form says, Mike, I want to do 6 days a week, daily 1RM, squat, bench, deadlift, and that's what I want to do on my first developmental cycle. Let's just say that's what he says. So you guys do that, and that shows a really, really positive rate of gain on that first developmental cycle. So naturally, if I'm interpreting kind of the way that you do things correctly, the next block, if you have a little bit of time towards the meet, is probably going to be somewhere in that direction. It may not be the exact same, but it's probably going to have very, very high RP work, minimal volume, if that's kind of what went well this past cycle. So again, I know you probably wouldn't prescribe training that way, so I'm not trying to straw man you in any way. It's just a thought experiment to kind of get at what maybe we're kind of seeing as a potential, like where we might see things a little bit differently. Just because that Bulgarian initial block led to a very positive short-term outcome in strength, I think the value judgment is that although it is an assumption, and that's very, very clearly stated, we might say that assumption is probably safer if we say that first block probably should include some more volume, because 90% of the time, to maximize his capacity for strength expression on meet day a couple months down the line, that's probably a good idea. Granted, that is still an assumption. I think that is a strength of your system, and I don't think you would design training that way. But I guess it's just like a thought experiment. To us, maybe that's one of the limitations of purely viewing success as short-term progress of a block in the way that it's designed. And maybe, again, maybe there's this line in the sand close up to a meet where we define progress differently. So I think that is this kind of a thought experiment I've run in my mind a few times of, yes, short-term strength progress matters a ton, especially close to the meet. I think I'm on board with you 100%. Where I might shift my focus a little bit, if we have this assumption that, you know, some of these tenets are probably a good idea a majority of the time, granted not always, maybe we shouldn't totally deem success based on those short-term outcomes, you know, farther away from things. So I'll let you riff on that. Again, you're probably going to take the softball and just knock it out the park, but go for it, man.
I hope, but I mean, you're absolutely right that, you know, you've got somebody that shows up first block, they want, you know, Bulgarian training essentially, and that goes well, you would probably explore similar territory, you know, and one of two things is going to happen. Either it's going to continue to go well, in which case that's awesome, or it won't, in which case you should try to explore someplace else. And it comes back to that explore, exploit paradigm. You know, if you've got time, then you're probably exploring, and it makes sense to explore not just what's worked, you know, things adjacent to what's worked in the past, but what you most reasonably expect to work going forward. Now, in your case, I would say that, you know, if you're coming at this from a perspective of saying, yes, that worked then, but I just don't believe that it can work in the future. I just don't believe that it's a long-term solution. Then I think that's perfectly reasonable to explore something quite a bit different. Sometimes you do have an explore block that just like goes completely into a different direction, like hard into left field, and maybe find something there. You know, it's less, I would say it's not even that it's less certain, it's just that the evidence that pushes you in that direction is just different, you know. And when, you know, again, sticking with this example, in one case you've got a prior block from that individual that went well. In another case, you've got more of a theoretical underpinning that supports it. And those things are just different, you know, and it kind of depends, again, on what you're trying to accomplish and how much time you've got and stuff like that. But I think that's totally valid. I do try to, I guess I try to make sure that I'm taking seriously the possibility that I could be wrong, you know, that whatever I'm thinking about this can be wrong. And you know, I need to prove to myself that whatever idea that I want to experiment with next is founded, you know, and which, I mean, I guess it makes sense in that case that we would come up with some different approaches because our background knowledge on like the knowledge in the background here is different, you know, like I'm leaning more heavily my experience and you guys are definitely more versed in the research and seems to be I definitely don't mean this in any sort of a slight, but you guys are gaining experience rapidly, you know, not to say that you don't have any. You've been coaching, I know, more than 15 minutes, you know, but yeah, you know, it makes sense that the knowledge that you bring to the table is affecting the decisions that you make.
Yeah. And I've heard you say this before, I think, again, in that anecdotes and observations episode from a couple of years ago, which I've probably revisited 5 or 6 times. Is you still work within the quote unquote constraints of exercise science, right? Like Zach kind of gave this thought experiment of a Bulgarian style program. And I think actually in that episode you said, yeah, I probably wouldn't end up there because that's just outside of what we, think may even work. So something that kind of popped in my head when Zach proposed this thought experiment, and Mike, when you were responding, is at the beginning of the podcast, I said we use a lot of the emerging strategies concepts, and just from an epistemological point of view, I think you would be a fool not to pick up some of these concepts, right? And so thinking about the Bulgarian example, and it's not to say that in a strength phase that we typically write, it's Bulgarian style, but what you can do if you are doing more of a periodized style is you can look at the rate of progress in the different phases and then retest the phase that went the best and see if it actually is a potentiation, right? So, we talked about for reactive training systems, the unit is the week of training. For us, the unit is the training cycle, and we add in the sequence. So if you remove the sequence, you can test and retest in the same way that you guys test and retest the unit of training that is the week of training. So, I think people will kind of notice that some of our thought processes lead to a different practical application, but at the end of the day, these concepts aren't mutually exclusive, and the thought process of training isn't mutually exclusive, whether you're doing an emerging strategies framework or a more periodized framework. You're just falling on a different point on the, whether you're prioritizing signal to noise or not, and what sacrifices you're able to make. So hopefully that adds some color to the, how we add in emerging strategies concepts.
Well, we started to talk about that, right? Like when this was in our chat from some months ago, we were thinking that, we kind of are coming at this from some different angles, but I wonder if at the end of the day, like how different are these programs that we would write? Like if we both got like identical athletes, like how different would they be, And then I went off and had twins, so just never had any time to revisit that program comparison, but I do think that would be interesting to do. And that's part of why I think this is so interesting, is that there's these layers, and you can start from different places but possibly end up in the same conclusion. But the thing is, like, how you arrive at the conclusion, that's where the value is from a coach as well. Like I happened across a Reddit thread where some people were posting programs and kind of saying to each other, like, oh my God, can you believe they charge this much for a program? So-and-so charges that. Like, that's absurd. Like, I wouldn't pay that much for a program. Like, well, you're not paying for a program when you hire a coach. And there's no program that you could ever just look at the X's and O's of the program and be like, oh my God, I'd pay $1,000 for that program. Like, that's not the value. The value isn't in, man, can you believe they did 4 sets of 5? Like, get out of here with that. Like, it's the decision making behind it that matters. And we could end up creating exactly the same program, but it's the decision making that's the value. Anyway, that's a rants aside, I guess. But you had another interesting direction to go there, and I ranted myself out of it. So yeah.
That was good, man. I noticed that he said 5s there, so that was correct. I just want to make sure that that's also clear. But yeah, Josh, I don't know if you have anything else on the agenda here. I don't know where we even started that little section of the conversation. Me and Mike are just really just going off on the tangents here, and Josh is,
Josh, please pull us back.
Yeah, pull us back.
Someone has to be responsible.
But I think what I was going to say is, like, I think it was Dr. Helms that made a post like coaches aren't washing machines. I think that was that was a really good, I really like that post. And that was, it just changed kind of my perspective on how this is all viewed. And like you said, Mike, just the experience, and then also the it's the trial and error of like the way you come to a conclusion. And like as a coach, once you get burned by, I got this figured out, this is the way that I'm supposed to make these decisions, and then you find the exception to that rule, and you're like, damn it, I got to start this over from square one. It's just like you can't have that from just looking at the X's and O's on a sheet. Like that's definitely not the entire story. And it's that trial process of trying to figure out what is the information I'm extracting from the response and what was given to the athlete, and trying to figure out the correct way to integrate all that and come to the appropriate conclusion in the most circumstances we can. Never will be perfect, of course. We're just trying to make those systems as best we can. But yeah, coaches aren't washing machines. That's how that. But Josh, yet again, bring us back to whatever we were supposed to be talking about. Sorry for derailing us yet again.
So what Mike said about and what Zach, you were just kind of talking about as well, the program, the actual numbers on the spreadsheet or whatever are not the product. Like you said, Mike, it's the thought process behind it. And I think that very much parallels with this podcast in general, is that we didn't actually give answers, and a lot of people want answers, but where the value is in the discussion and the thought process behind the product. So, even though it might not be satisfying that we both came to a conclusion that we agree on, and we didn't decide to go periodized or emerging strategies or top down or bottom up, hopefully the discussion can give insight into the thought process behind them, and notice that there's more similarities than differences. So I think we're probably at a pretty good spot to wrap up. So
I just wanted to say, look at that segue, Mike. That was why we pay him the big bucks right there. He just took that absolute hurricane that me and you were going on there and just wrapped it up nicely. That was great, Josh.
It's episode 5, man. We're getting the hang of this.
Yeah.
Did we shout out our intro music that we might have a chance of having if I don't mess this up?
Oh, yeah. One of Jake's clients, Chris, he's a musician, and he helped us out with some intro music. So whether or not there was intro music at the beginning of this episode will indicate whether we were able to actually figure it out. So if you made it this far, you can go back and recall whether there was intro music and see how good Zach is in figuring out how to edit a podcast.
I will say I did, in fact, figure out how to switch podcast hosts. So now we avoided the payment fee to keep the podcast episodes on the air forever. So we're inching in the right direction here. So we'll hopefully be able to figure out the music, and then we'll be ever inching closer to being true professionals here.
You might even say that your podcast processes are emerging.
Ooh.
Shameless plug right there. I think that's another meme Mike's going to go down and make here in the basement here in a little bit.
Yeah, bottom up podcasting, baby.
We got to keep the goal. I'm going to analyze the analytics tonight, and we'll develop our strategy from there.
Mike, I'm sure this podcast is going to get more listens than any other episode. So based on the emerging data, we need you on every single episode.
Yeah,
a little bit, but we're always
right.
This is our home base.
Yeah, I mean, don't stray too far from home base,
Well, hold on, guys. We got to realize that this podcast might perform the best, but is this the one that's going to make us grow? That's also, we got to take that into consideration here. We got to, might have to periodize things.
But balance your long term and your short term, right?
All right. Anything, Zach or Mike, you guys want to add some closing remarks before we wrap up here?
No, I just want to take a second to thank Mike. Obviously, we know he's a busy guy. He's obviously highly in demand to do this all the time, and just taking the chance to talk shop with us for a little bit. We always appreciate you, dude. First guest, so obviously that means something. You're in the VIP club with the minuscule podcast following we have right now. But hopefully we can have you back on and do this again sometime. But if you want to plug your stuff, I think you got a free webinar coming up.
I do.
Yeah,
I do. That'll be on Monday, so I guess that depends on the turnaround.
Yeah, putting pressure on me here. That's the kind of stuff we don't know. I didn't think to mention that, so that's thank you for that.
No. But yeah, I mean, there's that, but pardon me. If it's not that, it'll be something else. We're always working on something in this space, but you know, same goes for you guys. Thank you guys very much for having me. I always enjoy talking shop with you guys. You guys think about things seriously and aren't afraid to disagree with things that you disagree with. And that, for somebody like me especially, man, that's so important. Just that, like, I'm interested in the ideas, right? Like, if it's a bad idea, I don't want to keep it around, you know? So somebody's got to be willing to say that, you know, it stinks if it stinks. But yeah, definitely appreciate you guys having the conversation. It's always is interesting and illuminating for me. So I appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, again, just to echo what Zach said, thank you very much. We know your time is very valuable, so we'll let you get back to more important things. Again, thank you very much. We will link Mike's social stuff as well as reactive training system stuff in the bio. I guess we have to do that when we have a guest.
I don't even know if that's what it's called, to be honest. Is that what it's called? Bio?
Yeah, I think so.
Sure.
We'll figure it out. But anyway, again, Mike, thank you very much. If you enjoyed the podcast, leave us a rating and review. I think that helps, but we don't have enough data to indicate whether that's the case. And yeah, we'll wrap it up here. Thanks so much, guys.